To Watercolor with Viv, and today we'll be painting a raven in watercolor. Now here are the supplies that you'll need. You might want to take a screenshot, pause the video so you'll know. The first thing I'm doing is I'm wetting the raven's eye with clear water, and then I'm going to take some burnt umber and a little bit of anthraquinine blue and make kind of a dark bluish brown and just drop it in over the water. The clear water that I just put in there. I'm going to make it a little darker in the corner, and then I'm just going to take a clear water, a damp brush, and just spread all the color around. I'm going to do the other eye. The other eye I want just a tad bit darker, so I added a little bit more blue. And the reason it's darker is because it is on the shadow side of the raven. And his eye is not catching as much light. And I'm just doing that with the paper dry. And I'm just putting a little bit of shadow right under his lid there. Now I'm just going to take a little bit of violet, and I want it into a nice watery mix, about this consistency of skim milk. And then where his darkest shadows are, I'm going to go ahead and just paint a light wash of the purple, because I want to build up washes as we go with the layering technique. But I'm going to start with purple just to give it a little bit more vibrance. The purple will shine through the layers of the mixed blacks that we use. And it'll just give it a little bit more sparkle. I'm coming around, going to go around his beak, everywhere where the darkest darks are, where you see the darkest shadows on the raven. Just look at your reference photo and follow your reference photo and put in where the shadows are, the darkest shadows, with this pale purple, really watery mixture. And I'm just going to continue around his beak with the little shadows. Now I'm going the side of his head. It's really dark there, and I'm just taking clear water and blending out the violet to the purple that I just laid down, and just blending it across that area. And I'm going to continue to create his shadows wherever they're the darkest, right around his head. We're concentrating on his head. It really makes a difference where you put your concentration on. We want that to be the focal point. So his head we're going to do in more detail than his body, the feathers on his body. I'm just taking another pale wash of the violet and just going over the top of his head, and then the little top of his eye is a little bit darker, so I'm putting a little bit more blue in it just to darken it up some. I'm going to continue just to darken that while it's still wet on the side of his head here. And I'm going to come down and create the shadow that his beak is making on his feathers on his back. And I'm still using that pale purple. It's really watery. Now I'm going to do the inside of his mouth, and I've just added a little bit more alizarin crimson just to give it a more pink look on the inside. Just blending it out with clear water. And I'm using a number 2 brush here, in case you're wondering, a number 2 round. And what I forgot to mention is at the beginning I already had my masking fluid in place. There's masking fluid on this painting. It's already dried. I did that first and let it dry. So I'm able to paint over the areas that I want to remain white and not worry about them getting paint on them. They'll stay white with the masking fluid on top of them. Now I'm just taking cobalt teal, a really watery mixture of that with a tiny bit of ultramarine blue, and I'm just going over his beak because his beak has a little bit of a blue tint to it. And so I'm just going to do the wash over his beak. And I'm still using my number 2 brush. And I'm also getting in between the little whiskers. Ravens have whiskers across the top of their bill and down the bottom of their chin. Now each time we do a new layer, we want to wait for it to dry completely. So now we're really going in with a really dark, and that is the anthraquinine blue with burnt umber. And it is really, really dark. And it's about the consistency of cream, maybe just a touch thinner than cream, but not much. And we're just going to start with his whiskers, drawing the shadows of his whiskers across his top of his beak there, and the deep shadow that's right above his beak where his forehead and his beak meet each other, and come around to the other eye where it's really dark on this side because it's in shadow. So this side of the bird is actually darker than the other side that we're working on right now. And we're just going to keep putting tiny little lines. And you can see the white is actually the masking fluid showing through, and it's protecting that paper underneath there. I'm just going to keep on adding this really dark blue and brown mixture to wherever the darkest shadows are. Around his face, around his beak and his eyes. I'm going to keep on making the little wispy beards, little beard hairs and eye hairs, whatever they're called. I don't know what they're called, but all ravens have a sort of whiskers that go across the top of their bill, around down their face and underneath their bottom of their bill, and it looks really interesting if you ever see one up close. Now I'm taking that dark mixture again and just drawing a line, and then taking clear water and blending it out, and just adding a little bit more while the water is still wet, and just blending it out, and making little tiny tick marks just to give it some texture to indicate that there's feathers there, and leaving plenty of white spaces. We're not coloring it. We're not painting it all the way solid. We're leaving some white in there to give it some interest and to make it look like little highlights glinting across his feathers. And we're going to go right here at the bottom of his beak to the side and bottom where he has a nice dark shadow with this blue and brown mixture. And it's leaning a little bit more toward blue, so I'm going to add a little bit more brown to darken it up some. And I'm just going to continue around his beak, making sure I put that shadows in and making tiny little slashes just to indicate where the feathers separate, the shadows of his feathers where they're separating, and a little bit of the little whiskers. And in the end, it'll give it some texture as well, because we'll paint at least a couple of washes over. And when you're painting, remember, you can do as many washes as you like. You can stop wherever you like. Right now it's headed toward what I call the ugly stage, where a lot of watercolor artists, they get nervous and they stop because they think it's not looking right. But just keep going, have faith, it's going to turn out okay. And now I am adding that shadow from the beak, just pulling it on down there with a little bit of the pale lavender, violet, really watery, a lot of water mixed in. And we're just going to outline that shadow from his beak in the top of his head, down his back. And remember, as you're painting, to let the areas dry, go to another area and work, and then come back once it's dry and work on another area. So now we're going to do his tongue, and we are going to use the little bit of that burnt umber and pale and brown mixture that's really pale but more toward brown, a brownish gray, and paint his tongue in. Add just a little bit more of the blue with the blue-brown mixture, the anthraquinone blue and the burnt umber mixture, just in where we want the shadows. And we're going to come inside of his mouth here and start creating the shadows and the lines. If you look inside of his beak, you'll see different patterns of light and shadow, and we're going to try to indicate those. I'm going to paint over the rosy color just a little bit with this brownish gray mixture. That's the burnt umber with anthraquinone blue, but more brown than blue. It's the same that we used for his eyes. Now at the top of the head here, I'm just using a little bit of phthalo blue with the cobalt teal, and I'm kind of stippling it, just dabbing my brush down across his forehead. That's going to give him an indication of feathers up there. It also lets that violet shine through. Taking a little bit of cobalt teal, and I'm just going over his body feathers, going into the shadow even with it, and I'm just putting it in random places, also taking the violet, putting it in random places. I'm going to come back to that once it dries and shape those into feathers, into his body feathers, but I want it to go ahead and dry. Now I'm going to get a little closer so you can see better what I'm doing. I'm adding a little bit of alizarin crimson to the anthraquinone blue, the burnt umber, and I'm adding a little tiny bit of phthalo blue. And it is turning into a little, it's going toward the violet, which is fine. Now I'm going in his side of his mouth and do a shadow over the roof of his mouth. In the back, it's actually the back of his mouth, where his beak is putting a shadow on his back of his throat. And I just took some clear water and blended that, and now I'm just going to pull it down, and while it's wet, just add a little bit more shadow around the tongue. Now I'm going to go down this side of his beak where there's a really dark pronounced shadow on the inside of his lower beak. And I'm still using that same mixture. And that shadow that connects that upper shadow, the more pink shadow with the dark, deeper shadow, I went up there and got a little bit more water so it would be paler across the tongue, because it changes color as it goes over the tongue. Now I'm going to do the other side of the beak. And if you'll look on your reference photo, you will see that there is a very fine line right in between the two sides of the beak that is a really pale gray. So we're just going to leave that white for right now. And later on, once the two sides dry, we'll just wash over it with a paler gray just to blend it in. But right now we're going to leave it white. And you see I've painted up to the edge, but I did not let the dark blue and the blue brown touch each other in the middle where that line is, because I didn't want them to bleed together. I'm just going to add a little bit more shadow up here with the pattern design. If you'll look inside of his lower beak, you'll see that there's sort of a pattern with some different colors, different shades. I mean, there's shadows making patterns as well as colors, is what I'm trying to say. And I'm just washing back over just to make it look more unified. Now with this really dark color, since I've got it going, I'm just going to go down and make shadows inside of his eye. And then blend it just with a little bit of clear water. And I'm going to do the same to his other eye. Now when you paint, I want you to take your time. I've sped this up quite a bit, and I cut a little bits out here and there what wasn't that important. Just really showing you the most important parts, to try to keep it as short as possible. I would say this is a good 3 to 4 hour at the very minimum project for you to do, but I would encourage to take your time with it. Now that this is dry, I'm taking my rubber cement pickup and I'm removing some of the masking fluid from the painting. Remember to make sure that your painting's completely dried before you do this, because you don't want to smudge the wet paint and you'll ruin your painting. Now just come back in here into the really white areas, because it's going to look a little funny with all the stark white, and start adding a little bit of shadow in there, a little bit of texture. I'm using the same, this browny pinky gray color that is the alizarin crimson anthraquinine blue with a little bit of burnt umber. Now I'm coming back with this blue, which is cobalt teal, and a little bit of phthalo blue, and coming in where his little wispies, his little whiskers, and adding a little bit more shadow. If you look at the whiskers in the reference photo, they have a little bit of blue tint, so that's what we're doing there. Just coming in and darkening up some areas inside of his mouth again with that pinky brown color. Just kind of blending it in so that it looks a little bit softer inside. And darkening up that really dark shadow right there and blending it out with clear water down to the tip of the beak. Now you can start seeing the raven come. I want to call him a crow so bad, but there is actually a difference between crows and ravens, and this is a raven. And the reason I love ravens so much is because they are highly intelligent. They are as intelligent as a dolphin or a monkey, a primate. Now we're going to come back in here and do the shadows and the texture of his beak. And I'm using burnt umber with a little bit of ultramarine blue. And I'm just making his shadows. And we're going to let those dry. We're making the shadows and the texture that goes across his beak. There's also the really bright whites. We're kind of going a little bit into those, but we're leaving some of the bright whites that were covered by the masking fluid. We don't want to lose all of those. And this is the number 2 brush we're using. Really just getting in the texture, and we're going to let it dry, because we're going to paint back over this with another wash and soften it after it's completely dry though. Always remember, as you're painting your washes over each other, they have to be completely dry. So look at your reference photo and see where the colors are, see where the little shadows and the texture are, and try to replicate it. It doesn't have to be exactly. As long as you get the major shapes in there, it'll be fine. And just kind of give it an indication. And as you see, I'm leaving a little bit of the beak, the lower part of the top of his beak, without any of the design on it, because he has a little bit of a white highlight going down the side of his beak. I'm just blending a little bit more burnt umber over his eye. And then I'm just going to come back in here and add a little bit more texture to indicate feathers. And I'm still going to keep working on his little whiskers. And every time we do another layer of paint over it, it gets darker and darker. And I am using the anthraquinine blue with the burnt umber mixture to make these little dots. But remember, these are just the colors I'm using. I would love it if you would experiment with your own blues and browns and make your own darks and really apply yourself to this in your own way with your own color mixtures. You don't have to follow these exactly. Um, just use it as a learning experiment, a color mixing experiment. And again, I'm coming back up there, and this is really watery mixture of the blues and the browns, and I'm again just tapping in there with the tip of the brush just to give it texture, to indicate that there's feathers up there. We're going to soften it with another wash once this is dry. I'm coming back over here because this side of the bird is really dark compared to the other side, so I'm adding in a little bit more darkness. And I'm going to continue that down his shadow, down his back, the shadow from his beak and his head down his back. Now I'm just taking a little bit of that cobalt teal and just mixing it with the light brown, the same mixture that we used for the actual shadows of the beak, and just spreading it over in another wash just to kind of soften it down. I'm being careful to leave some areas white. I'm also going up into across his brow with this same really watery mixture. And I'm darkening up a little bit more of the feathers, the indication of the feathers across his head with this really dark mixture. And we're going to let that dry, and then we're going to come back over it. And we're just going to keep adding layers into the shadows as we go around, wherever we think it needs to be darker. Here I'm just adding a little bit of the darker and really tiny taps just to give it an indication of feathers. And again, we're going to soften it up later once it dries with some washes. And anywhere I see that he might need a little texture, I'm going to go ahead and put that in there. So now he's getting a little bit of feathers. Now this is a little bit of phthalo blue and a little bit of alizarin crimson. It's going to be kind of a reddish black, and just a little tiny bit of phthalo blue back in there, and we're going to put the shadow over the top roof of his mouth. Just layer it right over the other colors we already had, but remember they're dry now. And that really starts to make his beak pop. And we're going to go in there where we see little bits of shadow that are really dark, and we're going to just darken those up and start defining the inner part of his mouth more with this really dark, and just putting a little wash over that section. And I'm going to start putting in a little bit more shadow work across his beak and his whiskers. Putting more shadows up there. But as you can see, the lines that we put down first, the little tick marks, they're shining right through the shadow. You're not obliterating those. You're softening them up a little bit, but you can still see them, so you can still see that indication of texture. And that's why I'm telling you to put down your certain glazes first, letting them dry, and then putting over another glaze, because you can still see the texture, but it softens it up. And just keep on working into the darker areas with this really deep color. And that's phthalo, alizarin, and a little bit of anthracene blue. I'm just darkening up this really dark shadow. Now we're just going to put another layer using the same color. And remember to kind of pull little tick marks out, little feather marks Don't just do it flat. Let there be some variation in your strokes. And he's really starting to look like a raven already. Now we're just doing a light wash over everything. Well, not over everything, over the side of his head. While it's wet, I'm coming back with the darker color and just dropping it into the water so that it just flows over where it's wet in a nice little wash. And it's starting to soften up those tick marks that we made. See how it just automatically softens them up? They're not so bright and garish. And I'm adding a little bit of the cobalt teal here and there just to give it some color variation. Remember, I'm avoiding that highlight that's in between his two eyes right above his beak. We're just leaving that. We don't want that to be painted in. We need that highlight to define his forehead. And I'm just doing a few more little feather ticks here and there. And I'm also deepening this shadow right under his beak. And I'm not going to show you every single detail of everything, and I sped it up just because of time. But I am showing you the major techniques that we're using. It's just wet on wet, wet on dry, a little bit of dry brush, very little, and glazing, lots and lots of glazing, which is just layering the paint over another color after it's completely dry. And I'm just coming while it's still wet and putting a little bit more in there and just letting the water pull that dark color around and just feather it out. It gives it a really nice look. And just keep darkening up this side, because this side is really dark from the shadow. If you'll look at your reference photo, you'll see how dark it is on this side. Now I'm coming back in with a little bit of the cobalt teal in that browny gray, the alizarin with the phthalo gray, and coming back in and darkening up his beak where the shadows are and avoiding where the highlights are. I'm not painting over the white. I'm letting that stay, but where there's shadows, I'm coming in there and darkening it up. Just gives his beak some more shape. Now I'm just taking this really pale wash of grays, just from the whatever we've had on our palette here, and going in where there's shadows, putting a wash in it, and that automatically starts softening up those lines that we had made previously. Now this is still a little bit wet, so I'm taking a Q-tip, cotton swab, and just dabbing some of it out, and it leaves little highlights, and it really gives it a good effect of feathers. Now I'm coming back to the phthalo blue, alizarin crimson, and burnt umber, coming back down the side again, and it's wet on the side of his head, and I'm just letting that dark mixture flow easily over the water. Coming back in here, darkening up his beak some more, where the shadows are a little bit darker. Going around the other side of his beak, he's starting to look really good now. He's almost there. Of course, you can do more layers. You can take your time and really make him pop if you want to. Now I'm doing the really dark colors right where I want some shadows, and I'm just taking the brush and defining some of the shadows. I'm not going to paint each one of them out on this one. If you went to the Facebook Live and saw that, then you'll know how to do the body feathers. And of course I'm bringing in some more of the cobalt teal just to add a little extra color to it, and a little bit of the violet here and there. starting to divide out those shadows, really define them. And then you'll just keep doing that, keep going around, blending it out with a little bit of clear water, and just here and there where you want to define your shadows, you'll keep painting over it more and more glazes. And you'll probably want to leave a little white area just for your eye to rest. And here I'm just defining the shadows with the pale gray, defining the feathers with the pale gray, and going down into the shadows and darkening those a little bit more. And thank you for watching.